Welcome to the Stash Cast, where innovation meets real estate. Let's dive in.
Thank you so much again for coming to join me today. I'm really excited to speak with you.
I'm very pleased to be here today, Stash.
Awesome. So I found you at a mound site out in Chillicothe. You were one of the faces on a board, and I was like, I'm just going to call this guy. So for the folks at home that haven't found you a board like that, can you give us an idea of who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name is Brad Lepper. I'm currently the senior archaeologist for the Ohio History Connections World Heritage Program. I was hired in 1988 to be the site archaeologist and the curator for the Newark Earthworks and Flint Ridge.
Wow.
And I moved up in the organization, but I've never lost my fascination with and interest in doing research on the Newark Earthworks.
So the town of Newark was just built on top of, I guess, was it from the Fort Ancient culture or one of the others that it was built upon?
The Newark Earthworks are Hopewell. That's 2,000 years ago. The Fort Ancient culture, this is really confusing because the Fort Ancient Earthworks are part of the Hopewell ceremonial earthworks. And the giant enclosure there was built by the Hopewell culture, the ancient Indigenous American Indian Hopewell culture. Archaeologists, before they knew that's when it was built, were excavating in the South Fort area and came across a village that turns out to be a village of the Fort Ancient culture. As with the naming convention, they named the new culture that they'd found after the first site where they found it, which was the Fort Ancient Earthworks, and believed that these people built it. We now know better.
That's interesting. So maybe I guess before we dig into that specific site, we've got the Hopewell, Fort Ancient, and there's a third one, isn't there?
If we're talking about mound building cultures,
Yeah.
there was a preceding culture to the Hope called the Adena.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, and so they built small circular enclosures, 100 to 200 feet in diameter, and burial mounds, small and large. And then that transitions into what's called the Hopewell culture. But it's not a new people. It's not different people migrating in. It's the Adena were the ancestors of the Hopewell. The Hopewell was actually a little transitional period called the Late Woodland between the Hopewell and the Fort Ancient culture. People invent the bow and arrow. And these are all things that sort of balloon and explode in the Fort Ancient culture period.
For, again, the people at home that maybe aren't as fascinated by this as certainly I am, and you are as well, where did they primarily exist?
Because it's different for different cultures. The Adena were concentrated mostly in southern Ohio and in neighboring parts of West Virginia and Kentucky. Hopewell, basically the same area, but it expands a bit and goes into southern Indiana. The influence of Hopewell is what is remarkable because it extends to quite literally the ends of their world. Ceremonial regalia in Hopewell mounds are made of special raw materials that I think were brought to these sites by pilgrims coming from the Gulf Coast with conch shells, southern Canada with copper, and obsidian, a black volcanic glass. We know that came from Yellowstone Park, Obsidian Cliff, because of the chemical signature of that obsidian.
Wow.
And so I think thousands of people were coming here during the Hopewell period, at least at certain ceremonially propitious times.
What do we know about their ceremonies? Like, why do we believe that these earthworks that they created were ceremonial in nature?
One is that they're not cities. They're not places where people lived. They were gathering places. And a focus of most of them is on mortuary ceremonialism, burial mounds, interring the dead. There's always a mortuary focus to many of these sites, at least. And in addition, the architecture is aligned to the rhythms of the cosmos, whether that's to the summer solstice, sunrise and sunset, equinox, or particularly at Newark, to the rising and setting of the moon over its 18.6-year-long cycle. that linkage of mortuary that involves bringing the cosmic rhythms down to earth into this architecture, and ceremonialism that draws pilgrims from the ends of the world, bringing exotic, fascinating raw materials there to be transformed into ceremonial regalia that were then used in ceremonies. Then at the end of the ceremonies, they were broken into bits and burned on altars.
Oh, wow. Okay. Huh. Interesting.
The Stash Cast is brought to you by Needle. What if you could use data and analytics to predict real estate transactions? With Needle, you can. Check it out at needle.us to learn more.
So, have we found a settlement or a place where these people have lived? Because my story of exploration here is I went to Fort Ancient first, and it was a place I'd for years. And I've always been fascinated with the pre-American, pre-United States cultures. I'm listening to a book right now called Conquistador Voices, Christopher Columbus and Hernan Cortez by Kevin Seipel. And that's just their diaries or journals of what they were seeing from their account. And even, I didn't get great grades in college, but the subject that I got a 4.0 in, was ancient civilization. So I've always been fascinated by these. So one day I was in Xenia and I was like, let's go to Fort Ancient. We have some time. And so we did. And that is how we started our journey. And so we've since gone to Chillicothe a couple of times. We went to Mound City out there.
Oh, Junction.
Right. And that's where I found you. And so I guess my question was, have we found places where these people have lived? There's settlements, or did they settle?
Yeah, it's one of the remarkable things about the Hopewell culture, and one of the things that gives it the outstanding universal value. So that's a technical term that UNESCO uses by which to judge whether sites are worthy to be on the World Heritage List. They have to have outstanding universal value, not just national significance, not just local significance. And part of the story that brings this to that outstanding universal value level is that this monumental architecture, built on a scale and sophistication that rivals anything else being built in the world at that time, but it was not being built by a civilization that had an authoritarian leader, that had people living in cities, that had a big commitment to agriculture, that had a written language, and all the other characteristics of what we normally think of as a civilization. The Hopewell lived in these scattered little communities that archaeologists don't even call them villages because they're so small. They're a couple of houses. Think of it as a homestead.
Mm-hmm.
They do have some agriculture, but not corn. Corn doesn't come into the Ohio Valley until about AD 900, in that late woodland period.
Wow.
So they're eating sunflower, squash, goosefoot, little barley, plants that have been lumped together as the Eastern agricultural complex. So they're growing those crops, they're hunting, fishing, and gathering, but then periodically, hundreds, maybe thousands of these communities and pilgrims from far and wide come together at these sites to help construct them and then to perform ceremonies there.
How did they build them? I was out at Serpent Mound and they said it was a stick with a deer shoulder blade on it.
Because it's in such contrast to the sophistication of the earthworks, because they
Right.
were built with the simplest tools you can imagine. Like you say, the deer scapula hoe, shell hoes, pointed sticks, and baskets. And these people were like soil engineers. They knew where to find the colors of soil they wanted, because that's ceremonial. But they also knew what the qualities of the soils needed to be in order to build enduring monuments. So you don't just pile up a pile of sand, because after a few rains, that's going to melt away again.
Sure.
They built monuments that have lasted for more than 2,000 years. And in the case of sites in Louisiana, like Poverty Point and Watson Brake, for 5,000 or 6,000 years.
So I've seen them only as they are today, right? As most people have. So you mentioned different soils. Were these naked? Because right now everything has grass on it. So
Yeah.
were they uncovered essentially?
The grass covering was needed to preserve them. So there may have been a time after they were immediately built when those colors would have been evident. Very rapidly, vegetation would grow on it, and that preserves the earthworks. The National Park Service many years ago did some studies at Revolutionary War earthworks in Virginia and found that they eroded almost not at all. They were very well preserved by the grass and the roots from the grass and some trees that would hold it together. And it was only when a tree growing on it would die and fall over and pull up a root ball that it was subject to any serious damage.
Interesting. It seems to me that there's a correlation with the Scioto River and many of these sites. Is that just, am I right with that? Do they follow the rivers?
Most of the Hopewell sites follow the several rivers that flow south into the Ohio River. Like Fort Ancient, for example, is in the Little Miami River.
Mm-hmm.
Marietta is where the Muskingum River joins the Ohio River. Portsmouth is where the Scioto River comes. There is a heavy concentration of these sites on the Scioto, and that's where most of the Hopewell Culture National Historical Park sites are located, in the Scioto Valley or in the neighboring Paint Creek Valley. That Paint Creek flows into the Scioto River.
Interesting. So what was it about this neck of the woods, this part of the world, that drew these people here and then kept them here to the extent that they decided, hey, we're going to build a bunch of these earthworks here?
We know part of the story. We know the geography, the fact that most of these sites are located at the boundary between the glaciated part of Ohio and the unglaciated part of Ohio. So that's two separate physiographic provinces, the Till Plains and the glaciated Appalachian Plateau, which on the one hand makes it a very sort of rich area because you have what ecologists call an ecotone, a junction of two very rich biomes. So you have lots of options about what to eat and how to gather foods and things. The rivers certainly are important as a means of transportation. So there's all these reasons, why Ohio over the centuries has been a central place, because you've got the Great Lakes, you've got the Ohio River, which goes to the Mississippi. It's like this juncture of transportation arteries. That's a reason for it being here. And since we have no Quran or Bible to tell that story, we're just left to wonder. Ceremonial leaders here came up with these ideas and these visions that caught people's imagination, caused them to voluntarily come and build this monumental architecture.
Yeah. So a lot of these structures have square and a circle, and they follow similar dimensions. They're not all the same size, but they all follow the same proportions.
And many of them are the same size. There's Newark has this observatory circles, what it's called, connected to the octagon. It's one of the two main sites at Newark that got preserved. In addition to the circle and octagon, there's the Great Circle. But the circle connected to the octagon in Newark is called the Observatory Circle. And it's been called that since the 1800s because opposite the neck that leads into the octagon, on the other side of that circle, there's looks like a former gateway that was blocked off by a large mound. And that mound is twice as tall as the rest of the earthworks.
Okay.
Now we have a much sort of different significance of that word observatory, because if you stand on that observatory mound and sight through the parallel walls that connect it to the octagon and out the far gateway of the octagon, you're looking precisely at where the moon rises at its northernmost point only once in a generation. That is the alignment of the northernmost rise of the moon at one end of its 18.6-year-long cycle.
Wow.
So it is a kind of observatory.
Sure.
But it's not like astronomers there trying to work out the orbital mechanics of astronomical bodies. It's a ritual connection because the indigenous people all over the world at this time viewed the sun and the moon as powerful supernatural beings, and discovering that they had rhythms and incorporating those rhythms in the architecture was a way of bringing those rhythms down to earth, making what happened in those enclosures at particular times really spiritually significant.
I guess as part of your work, have you tried to? So if we know that some of these sites have these spiritually significant dates associated with them or astrologically, have you tried to see what's the theme, or maybe it is or was that they were chasing or devoting to, or
Written record. But to go back to your geometry thing, that observatory circle, the diameter of that circle is 1,054 feet, and it's a very precise circle. And Ray Hively and Robert Horn worked out some of the geometry and the astronomy. They were scholars from Earlham College in Indiana back in the late 70s, early 80s. They worked out the astronomy for the first time. And they also helped to work out the geometry, some of which was noticed even in the 1800s. They would survey their earthworks and notice that some of these were the same size. But that observatory circle diameter, 1,054 feet, is actually a specific term, that other OCD. This is the observatory circle diameter.
yeah.
And 1,054 feet shows up either in total or in precisely half or in precisely a quarter at all of the Hopewell ceremonial earthworks, the World Heritage nomination, those 8 sites, and many others as well.
Yeah.
And it's famous now for the Pumpkin Festival. But it's named Circleville because it originally had one circle inside another circle connected to a square there. The outer circle was 1,200 feet in diameter, and the inner circle was 1,054 feet in diameter. So these Hopewell surveyors could build precise monumental enclosures of the same size all over the place.
That is just fascinating. I wonder what the significance of that was for them.
It's from the little I've read about Pythagoras and working out geometry in ancient Greece. I've read that he viewed his sort of discoveries in geometry as unveiling the mind of God, that geometry was some divine principle. And the Hopewell surveyors were not Pythagoreans. There was no contact. But this amazing geometry that we're devising out of our minds isn't something we invented. It's something in nature, and it's divine because it's perfect. Yeah.
That's interesting about Circleville. Yeah. Ashamed. It probably breaks your heart when you see what either is or was a mound out in a farmer's field.
Yeah. It's tough to see so much of this rich indigenous heritage simply being reduced to oblivion.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's the other side of the coin, like at Newark, how much has been preserved. The circle and octagon and the Great Circle, for example, are still not pristine, but nearly pristine. It's almost pristine in the case of the Great Circle in particular, because it was saved very early. But parts of the octagon were being plowed down before it was preserved, and then it was restored to match what early maps had showed. But they are the best places, I think, to go to experience pristine or nearly pristine, gigantic geometric earthworks. And Fort Ancient and the nearby Fort Hill, which is not part of the World Heritage nomination, the Fort Ancient earthworks are the best examples and the largest examples of monumental hilltop enclosures.
Mm-hmm.
Early Europeans thought they looked like Iron Age hill forts, considered them to be forts. The Fort Ancient is 3.5 miles of earthen walls.
Yeah.
It's got interior ditches or moats that were filled with water. If it was a fort, those would be on the outside of the walls.
Sure.
Or,
yeah.
So you've built a giant fort and then you've punched all these holes in the fort.
Right.
So how anybody would conceive that was a fort is strange.
Why is Mound City in Chillicothe why is there such a dense collection of these mounds there?
It's hard to answer that kind of a why question.
Yeah.
What's remarkable to me, I've never worked there, but I've worked closely with the folks that do work there. There's been a lot of investigations there over the years, and they've had a lot of radiocarbon dates. And what's surprising is the shape of that enclosure is relatively unique, a square with rounded corners. And when those burial mounds were excavated, before the mound was there was a timber structure there.
Right.
And the timber structure was a square with rounded corners. And so that would have been a sort of a place where they were performing rituals, they were cremating ancestors. And then when they cremated the ancestors, they would build a small mound over that. And when the floor got filled up with burial mounds, they'd build one big mound over it, and then perhaps build another timber structure nearby to fill that up with cremation burials. All those mounds in there that are crammed in the small area have square with rounded corner houses enclosing ancestors. But then this perimeter wall, which I understand, it was the last thing built. So it's not like they built an enclosure and then filled it with mounds. They had this high density of mounds and then built an enclosure around it that just happened to correspond almost exactly to this square with rounded corners. And so that was a big ceremonial house for all the little houses inside that were covered with mounds and filled with ancestors. So it makes this bigger community.
So what has been learned of the people, I guess if they were cremated, we don't know that much about them.
Well, I suppose the Hopewell did more cremations than extended burials. But we also have to recall that the archaeologists in the 1800s and early 1900s were excavating these indigenous burial mounds without the consent or consultation with any indigenous tribes. Indigenous tribes obviously feel that these were desecrations.
Sure.
And I can fully understand that view. But it has enabled us to learn a lot about the society. For example, both men and women could be buried with large quantities of regalia. And in fact, the two people found, I'm not sure if they were in the same mound or not, but there were two people that have the first and second most enormous quantities of regalia buried with them. And number one is a man and number two is a woman. And so men and women both had very high status in this society and could be obviously ceremonial leaders, which we wouldn't know if we hadn't done those excavations.
Yeah.
Exposing all that regalia, though, also allowed us to see the full extent of this culture.
Assume that these people were the ruling elites of the societies, or no?
That's another aspect of the Hopewell culture that's so fascinating, is because all the communities we find, the houses are all the same. And when we have looked at the skeletal features of the people that are buried in the mounds, all of them, even the ones buried with the most regalia, show muscle attachment scars that indicate they worked hard for a living. They all ate the same foods. This becomes very different 1,000 years later at Cahokia, because Cahokia is a city. 20,000. There's a giant pyramid in the middle of that with a palace on top. And the guy that's buried there, based on what I've read, didn't work a day in his life, had much more access to meat than everybody else. Everybody else that he literally looked down on were eating basically just corn, which is not a very substantial diet to live on. There was an authoritarian leader with dictatorial power that could tell people, build me a giant mound, do this, go to war for me, whatever. There's nothing like that in Hopewell. The person buried with the most ceremonial regalia, at the end of the day, when they step outside those enclosures, they go back home, hunt, fish, gather, hoe their gardens, just like everybody else.
Clearly, to be buried with that significance of regalia, these people had to be extraordinary in some way. We just don't know what way.
They were the extraordinary astronomers that worked out the rhythms, or architects, but more likely they were just respected ceremonial leaders.
Yes. It's just fascinating.
Oh, yes.
First time I went there, I'd been to Serpent Mound and Fort Ancient and a couple of other sites, and you get off 75 and you're weaving through a neighborhood and then you come around a bend and bam, there it is. And it's just, what? I was just so surprised at its location, but you get up there on top, you can see for miles around you when you're at the top of that mound.
Some people over the years have suggested that some of those big mounds on hilltops were signal mounds. And if you got up on those and set a fire, you could signal for great distances. But we don't have any direct evidence that fires are being set up there from any investigation. And it may just be that high places are closer to heaven. You just want to be on the high places because you're closer to the sky deities in the sky. So it's hard to say. We have no direct evidence that they were used in particular as places where people could signal and so on. But clearly high places are interesting for a lot of reasons,
Sure.
because they're closer to God, the spirits.
What have been some of the most surprising or some of the favorite things that you have encountered or discovered over your career?
I think the most important ones have been serendipitous. For example, it involved working with Indigenous people in one way or another because their traditions, as fractured as they may be because of all the dislocation and the forced re-education. One of my colleagues, my boss actually, in the example I'm about to share, said that Indigenous people might not even know what they know. And I'd been going to Oklahoma, meeting and consultation with tribes over a couple of years. One of the consultations out there, it was being held at the Eastern Shawnee building, and it had a little museum in it. We were in the meeting rooms, and after a meeting, the director of this Eastern Shawnee Museum was showing me through the exhibits. We had stopped at the exhibit of the Shawnee drum, which is a water drum. And at that time, Chief Barnes was the second chief of the Shawnee tribe. So there are 3 different Shawnee tribes, and we were at the Eastern Shawnee site, but this was the second chief at that time for the Shawnee tribe. And he stopped to talk about the drum because it's very important in his own ceremonial community. And he started explaining to me how they attach the leather drum head to the drum body. And he said, we go to this special place and we take these perfectly spherical black stones and use them to wrap around the edges of the leather piece and tie them off, and then use that to tie cords to pull it down so that it tightens them on there. And after he explained that, I looked at him and I said, well, that's really interesting. At Site Mound in Chillicothe in Ross County, they found in this burnt offering 5 perfectly round black stones. They said, and they all had different engravings on them. And I said, do you ever engrave those stones? And he said, no. But that started a conversation, and we started emailing back and forth. And whenever we'd get together, we'd talk about it. So I co-author a paper with a Shawnee chief that talks about, because when those stones were first excavated in the 1930s, the archaeologist from the Ohio History Connection said they were marbles. No documentation of the game of marbles in Indigenous traditions before white people get here.
Yeah.
They're not marbles, they're drum stones. They're found in this burnt offering where the hide and the wooden shell or whatever would have burnt away. All that would be left were those stones.
Right.
So we came to this argument that this is evidence of the earliest drum we know of in the Eastern North America. And just working together like that, him from the position of his ceremonial traditions and how he puts together the ceremonial drum, and me coming from an understanding of the archaeological record and things that might be related, finding them, and just serendipitously meeting at this weird time at lunch at this facility where I was consulting. It's just like a freakish, serendipitous thing. Ben Barnes wrote that it was very powerful for him to see his ceremonial traditions reflected in 2,000-year-old ancestral sites.
Right.
Enabling him, helping him see that connection and make that connection has been, I think, one of the most powerful experiences in my career.
Just because, like you said, they know things that they don't even know that they know. Because he was telling you, this is how we built the drum.
Yeah, because Ben was taught by his ceremonial elders. I don't know if it would have been his father or mother or whatever, but he's learned that from his elders. When the idea that actually goes back at least 2,000 years, now he can say that.
Yeah. I haven't been to Newark. Why did the settlers build towns right on top of these locations? Was it just, this is a good spot for a town, like Circleville, for instance?
Yeah, because all these places really that end up building over, they're good places to build things that won't get flooded out and are good dry places, but there's plenty for people to eat around them. They want people to come there, so they're on water avenue, transportation avenue things on right along the water. So they're there for all the same reasons that the Hopewell were there, except they're not there to worship. They're there to live and raise families and grow crops and things like that. It makes sense that these indigenous people are picking the best locations to build these places to be sustainable. And those are the same reasons Europeans wanted to live there too.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm thinking about Chillicothe right now. Chillicothe seems to have a lot of these sites there.
It was the first capital of Ohio.
You go there and you can see that it was a bustling metropolis, and then they moved the capital to Columbus. But why do you think Chillicothe? I guess it's because you have the Toyota there, and you have the Pink Creek come into Chillicothe as well.
Yeah, I think it's just a little bit north of the town, and it goes off to the west. But yeah, it's a tributary of the Scioto in and around Chillicothe.
How do you decide if your mission is to go and say, all right, we're going to go find some of these Hopewell settlements? How do you do that?
These first amateur archaeologists would be finding lots of Hopewell artifacts in the area. And then a group of archaeologists have excavated a couple of these places now that are extremely large timber buildings. And they interpret those as settlements. There's other reasons for thinking that maybe they have other interpretations, like maybe they're a kind of guild hall, or maybe a place for clans or voluntary groups that come together, like the Ojibwe and Midewiwin Society. But close to the earthworks, and they're really big, we'd find small communities that are ephemeral, that maybe you find some post molds, fire pits, storage pits, and Hopewell artifacts. So for the longest time, people thought there should be cities associated with them and didn't find any evidence. But we have started over the last couple decades finding these little small communities that are ephemeral, like they're only living there for a couple of seasons and then moving on, pretty mobile, even though they're farmers in addition to being hunter, fishers, and gatherers. But if hunting, fishing, and gathering is really important to you, and there are other communities around, you want to be careful not to hunt all the deer in the valley. You want to be mobile, so you keep the resources like deer sustainable by not overhunting. So maybe that's why they were living in small communities and moving around a lot. And what these large buildings are associated with the earthworks is, I think, still an open question. A lot of archaeologists think those are habitations and they're living there for year round. Most of that's probably true, but maybe they're like the caretakers, because if they're growing in prairie, those prairie grasses get real tall, and there would have to be like a caretaker there. Oh, it's getting close, a couple more weeks and it'll be the northernmost rise of the moon. Let's burn off the prairie so that the earthworks will be more visible. But people
Help facilitate the ceremony, essentially.
Yeah. There's still debate about where the Hopewell people are living and what they're doing in the times when they're not doing ceremonies at the earthworks. If people are coming from the ends of the world and people are coming from Yellowstone Park, they're probably not living the same way that Hopewell people in Ohio are living. Here for weeks at a time, doing different things. And so that may be one of the difficulties in identifying the signature, is there's a lot of variability in what's going on.
Wow. What did these people eat? I grabbed a couple of pawpaws and I brought some of the fruits and I let them ripen and I had them. They're delicious, but you can't subsist on just those. So what other, you mentioned corn earlier, deer. What other things have we found, or have you found, that I'm just trying to get an idea of what daily life might have been like?
This is really interesting because the Hopewell were not growing corn. Corn doesn't come into the Ohio Valley until about AD 900. But what we know they're eating are the plants of the Eastern Agricultural Complex: sunflower, squash, goosefoot. Goosefoot is like quinoa, little barley, plants that are local plants that they domesticated. But they're also hunting, fishing, and gathering deer, beaver, or especially deer. We find lots of deer bones at feasting sites at the Hopewell sites, and fish. But what's interesting is Indigenous American Indians are the tallest, healthiest people in the entire record of indigenous remains that have been studied.
Wow.
Peoples. Hunter-gatherers have a rich diet during spring, summer, and fall, but during the winter, there can be periodic periods of starvation. And we see that in the teeth and in some of the bones. They develop lines where when that person was growing during that winter, they got very little to eat. So their bone growth slowed and almost stopped. And those show up as little lines in the bones and teeth. Those are really common in hunting and gathering people at this latitude. The Hopewell, they start bringing in cultivated plants that they can provide a storable surplus. After the Hopewell, corn comes in, and people just start eating almost corn and practically nothing else. They're still hunting, fishing, and gathering, but their health goes to heck. Their teeth are rotting out. They're dying of abscesses. After the Hopewell, warfare seems to be happening more then. In Hopewell, we see no examples of warfare. There's no examples of burials with people with bashed in skulls or broken arms from fending off a blow, or spear points or arrowheads in their ribs. We see examples of that in earlier periods, and we see lots of examples in later periods, but it seems to be like a golden age when there was peace, when people could travel from one end of the country to another safe to come to these places on pilgrimage, and people lived relatively longer and were healthier and probably lived longer because of that reason than people either before or after.
It's fascinating. If we were to go back 2,000 years ago and we encountered some of the Hopewell people, would they be about the size of modern humans in height?
Like modern Europeans in America were probably taller.
Uh-huh.
You could get individuals in Hopewell time that reached 6 feet, maybe a little bit bigger than 6 feet would be rare. The average would be, below 6 feet. So we have much taller people now, but yeah, people before and after would be noticeably shorter than that.
You mentioned at the top of the conversation when the glaciers did cover a good part of North America. Where did that line stop?
There's a big bulge that comes down in western Ohio, not quite to Cincinnati, but it goes pretty far down. And then because of the way the Appalachian Plateau curves up, there's a much smaller bulge in central and eastern Ohio. So it comes down really far south to the west, but in the other parts, it's getting hung up on the Appalachian Plateau.
How far did the Hopewell civilization, did it get all the way up to what is current or present day Cleveland and Buffalo, or was that a different culture up there?
There are echoes of Hopewell into southern Canada, all the way out. It's derivative of what's going on in Ohio, but not the same kinds of expressions. Florida has a kind of Hopewell. There's a site there called Fort Center, and it's not an earthwork, it's a circular ditch. But the diameter of that ditch is 1,200 feet, which is the same diameter as Newark's Great Circle. It's more or less contemporary too.
Right.
So there's echoes of Hopewell from people, I think, coming to these pilgrimage centers, giving their gifts, experiencing this architecture, going back home, and maybe wanting to replicate a ceremonial center here that they can perform ceremonies in their local areas. But it's nothing on the scale and precision that we see in that central core area, the Hopewell core in southern Ohio.
So it was a really special time in North American history.
Yeah. Why are they there?
Yeah.
But there are these more fundamental questions you want to know.
Right.
Jerusalem and what happened there. And without the Bible or Quran or something to tell you that, something equivalent, we're just left with knowing something like that happened here. When the echoes reverberate through much of North America.
Yeah, I wonder if as AI comes in, that one might be able to stitch together geographic sites with the lunar and celestial events to maybe come up with some, you'll never know for sure, but maybe some hypotheses of what these places were built for.
let's say I'm confident that AI can come up with good stories,
Yeah.
but I have no faith that it will come up with realistic or authentic or stories that actually make sense. If that makes sense
Yeah.
to you.
Yeah. I guess I was just thinking, okay, if we know the coordinates, the latitude and longitudes, and then if we know, for instance, you said in Newark, that observatory mound is centered perfectly on the 18-year lunar cycle. I want those sorts of things. Like, you're never going to be able to put it, you're never going to know what was going through these people's minds. But I guess that would just be an interesting thing to explore.
Yeah. But those
Interesting.
why questions are the hardest to answer. I mean,
Yeah.
that's archaeology is really good at that. I'm not saying that you necessarily have to have a historic record to fill in the blanks, because I think as archaeology gets better, we can infer all kinds of things from where artifacts are found and what kinds of artifacts and how those artifacts are used. And if the database is big enough, we can infer all kinds of things from those clues. The way detectives go to a crime scene and find out all these clues to the foot size and all the things they find that lead them to a solution. But we can't get into that inner sanctum of information that's just not knowable from stuff. It's in their head.
Right.
Of course, what's in your head often gets manifested like 1,054 feet. They're not measuring in feet clearly, the geometry that's embedded in the sites, the astronomy. So if those are things that were in their heads that they embodied in earthworks.
Archaeology evolved over your career.
It involved a huge sea change, largely because of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So, like, probably the first half of my career, we never consulted with American Indians. We didn't even think about consulting with them because they were in Oklahoma, living their own lives. Due to forced relocation and forced re-education, I dug a trench co-directed an excavation of a trench through the Great Circle to learn how it was built. We didn't ask any indigenous people if it was okay to do that, or if they cared, or if they wanted to know what was inside the earthwork. Largely, I'm sure indigenous American Indians would not want us digging holes and things like that, but that didn't occur to me.
Yeah.
But now with the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, I think it was 1990 that was signed in, we're required to consult. It's like we're giving American Indians agency again, to be involved in questions about their heritage. And I suppose early on I was resentful because they were infringing on my privilege. I want to go out and dig mounds and learn more about things in the earthworks. And now they're telling me I can't. But having gone out there summer after summer, year after year, and listened to them, of course, they should be intimately involved in these decisions. It's their heritage.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's just been a big sea change over these decades, and I happen to have my career stretch over both of them. I don't feel bad for the things that I've learned through these excavations because it's allowed us to tell this richer story about the Hopewell culture, but to involve indigenous American Indians in that process. If they tell me not to dig somewhere or that's not a good idea, that absolutely, that's what we'll do. Now they do. And like the work I was able to do with Ben, I never could have done that back in my old career because I wouldn't have thought, why would you ask a modern American Indian whose lives not too different from ours? They're just modern people like we are. What are they going to know about what happened 2,000 years ago?
What did you learn about the construction when you did dig that trench?
Well, it was a bunch of some serendipitous things came out there too. One of the things we learned was that the outer wall was a different color than the inner part of the wall. That there was a trench inside the Great Circle. It's a construction sequence that we infer from our profile, is that they determined they wanted a diameter of 1,200 feet. So they'd put a stake in the ground, measured precisely from its distance between other enclosures, and then stretched out a 600-foot long rope, and then probably walked around in a circle. And in our trench at the bottom, there was this small clay mound. And we picture that they built like a whole circle of little clay mounds to determine the diameter. And then they dug the ditch and got all of the black, dark brown earth left a gap from the ditch, and then piled that all up on the mounds. So at the end of that stage, there's this dark brown, almost blackish embankment, a gap, and then the ditch. And then they brought bright yellow-brown material from deep within the earth and piled it from the edge of the ditch to the top of the mound. So when it was first finished, there'd be this dark brown wall if you were approaching it from the outside, and a bright yellow-brown wall if you were on the inside. At the Great Circle, they didn't do that. They built it right on the existing surface. So we actually got to see the whole soil profile beneath the earthwork. And I was working with a colleague from Denison University, who was a soil scientist, Todd Frolking, and he's looking at that soil profile. So if you're not an aficionado of soils, all the different layers and the different zones of color tell you a story. And there's like the A horizon, which is where it's dark brown organic, and then it becomes more clay, and so it can have different zones. And he's looking at the different zones and the different thicknesses, and he looks at me and says, Brad, that doesn't look like a forest soil profile. It looks like a prairie soil profile. And I said, no, Todd, we know what the environment was like 2,000 years ago when it should be a forest. And he's, So we took samples out of the top layer and sent them to a paleoethnobotanist, a woman that studies like seeds and other kinds of particles in soils that can tell you what the environment was like. And she looked at those soils and she says, yeah, this looks not like a forest. It looks more like a grassland. Now, a prairie is something specific, but something like a prairie. And then it occurred to me, I don't know if you ever read the book 1491, what America was like before Europeans.
I'm going to go back and listen to it.
But one of the things indigenous people do, not just in America, all over the world, Australian Aborigines, this kind of thing, they burn off chunks of forest, deliberately keep them burnt off season after season, because a forest has very few deer in it, but a forest with lots of prairie openings has lots of deer in it. So after 16,000 years ago, when indigenous people came here, this was never a wilderness. It was a managed environment. People were clearing the areas, keeping them clear so that they could have more deer to hunt. And that's just one example. So it got here. And so they saw it as this blank slate that they could construct their earthworks, laying out these ropes and circles without having to worry about trees. They could see from horizon to horizon, watching the sun and moon rises. And so they inscribed their masterpiece on this blank slate at Newark, combining, I think of it as the Newark Earthworks as the grand synthesis of Hopewell architecture, art, ceremony, ritual, astronomy, and geometry. You got a king here.
Yeah, I'm going to call you when we head up there. So that's interesting. They had previously, in some of the other earthworks, stripped the soil.
Really strip the soil? Wow. To then build their earthworks on that.
I'm just thinking about the manpower to do that.
And if you've got thousands and thousands of people there, the Great Circle, one of the reasons, this is an object lesson, it was used as a Civil War training grounds. After the Civil War, there was a grand reunion of the soldiers and sailors who'd served in the Civil War from Ohio, held there. And President Rutherford B. Hayes came to give orations, and President James Garfield, soon to be President Garfield, and William Tecumseh Sherman. And they were going to speak at this temporary speakers platform at the center. And the Cincinnati newspaper says 20 to 30,000 people gathered in the Great Circle to hear those orations.
Wow.
So do I think 20 to 30,000 indigenous people gathered there 2,000 years ago? My answer would be yes. Why else make it so big?
Yeah.
Because you're expecting thousands of people to gather there.
Wow. So I reached out to you with the Ohio History Connection. What is that organization? I've enjoyed several of the sites.
Yeah, it's one of the few places in the country, it's not the only one, where a private nonprofit organization is in charge of the state's heritage. So we used to be called the Ohio Archaeological and Historical Society. Then we were the Ohio Historical Society, and then we became the Ohio History Connection to be more modern. But we're doing the same job. We have museums around the state to share information about the state's heritage, especially the Ohio History Center in Columbus, the headquarters. Around 50 sites around the state that some of them are owned outright by the state, and we care for them and interpret them for the public on behalf of the state. And some of them are owned by the Ohio History Connection, and we interpret them as part of our stories. So our job is to preserve artifacts relating to the state's history, to preserve sites relating to the state's history, and to teach Ohio, and with World Heritage, far beyond Ohio now, about the heritage of Ohio. That includes
Ulysses
the
Grant.
Wright brothers, Ulysses Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, George Armstrong Custer was born here. And that's what I've been focused on. Although as an archaeologist, the Ohio History Connection, I've worked on sites of all kinds of periods that are, like if we're building a new road or building a new museum, the area where the ground will be disturbed has to be investigated to make sure we don't build it on top of something important.
Yeah, and I come from a real estate background, and part of me looks at land as, okay, what's the highest and best use in an economic standpoint? But on the other part of me, why we're having this conversation, is that there are places that are interesting and need to be preserved. New multifamily units be damned.
Yep.
My last question, what inspired you to become an archaeologist?
This is a funny question for me always, because I've wanted to be an archaeologist for as long as I can remember.
I love
I remember in fourth grade, when people, oh, what do you want to be when you grow up? And people said, I want to be an archaeologist.
Yeah.
I never collected artifacts, which is what so commonly archaeologists, like they go out and find an arrowhead in a field and get obsessed and collect artifacts. And they were collectors before they went to school and became archaeologists. My mom gave me an arrowhead she was the secretary of the elementary school, and it was in the lost and found for years. And so she gave it to me. And I never wanted to go out in the field and collect because I was afraid I'd ruin something. So I wish I knew what inspired me so I could tell a good story. But it's just like, for as long as I was able to pursue that dream and become exactly what I wanted to become. I know probably lots of, I feel very lucky that I've been able to do that.
Do you think that the hope chose you, or you chose the hope?
I didn't. That came about rather as an accident too, because when I was in grad school, what I wanted to study, what are called the Paleo Indians. So those are people here, the first indigenous people here in the Ice Age, hunting mammoths and mastodons. And the reason I chose that is because after my first survey class on the history of Eastern North America, Ohio, the beginning of the story, the beginning of the human adventure in Ohio, in America, is when Ice Age people came from Asia and entered into the New World. And that we think that happened now about 20,000, maybe 23,000 years ago. And so in my mind back then, getting started, if this is the whole history and there's all these different periods, if you want to study the past, it's because you think the past has the clues to explain where we might be going. And so if I just chose to study hope, that's not the beginning of the story. I need to go to the beginning of the story and understand that. So that helps you understand what came next, which helps you understand what came next. So I was all about studying the Paleo Indians, the first chapter in Ohio's and America's history. There were people in my department who were going for Hopewell, and they seemed to look down on me. They were like kind of snooty. Oh, we're studying the great Hopewell culture, and you're just down there grubbing in the dirt looking for little spear points and things. So I did my dissertation on Paleo Indians, graduated, worked for a year in what's called the cultural resource management industry. But that's where you're examining fields that are going to become roads or dams or housing developments or something. So the people you're working for don't want you to find it because it'll hold it up. Got tired of doing that for a year. And then this job at the Ohio History Connection came up. I was applying all the time for university positions, thinking I'd get that dream tenure track job. But this opportunity to be the site archaeologist at the Newark Earthworks came up. I applied for it and got the job. And so then I just started reading everything I could so I could be the best interpreter I could, fell completely in love with these places and became fascinated with them and wanted to help preserve them and Wanted to see them someday on the World Heritage List.
That's amazing. That's great. Did the Hopewell leave any traces of language that we've been able to interpret?
Because there's no written language.
Uh-huh.
We see the same kinds of symbols all through the Hopewell world, so to speak, some of the same important things, but no, given their extent, we know that like historic Ohio, when Europeans first get here, there are a dozen or more tribes here, and they represent at least 3 separate language families. So the Iroquoian in the north, the Algonquian sort of in the central, and Siouan in the south. That diversity right there in the historic times gives us a clue to the diversity that would have been here during Hopewell times when people were coming from everywhere.
Yeah.
So we can't say this tribe built the earthworks. What we can say is all the tribes in at least this area were involved in some way in coming here, sharing things, giving offerings, helping to build the earthworks. So when people ask me, like in the Eastern Woodlands, which tribe built the mounds, I say all of them.
Yeah.
There were certainly tribes more local that would have felt it's their home where they lived permanently, could have been and probably was involved with what was going on here.
So fascinating. Dr. Lepper, I appreciate your time today, and thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
That's it for the Stashcast. Subscribe, share, and stay ahead in commercial real estate and prop tech. See you next time.